In the dense, fog-laden outskirts of Hollow Creek, a small town noted for its unsettling number of unsolved mysteries and eerie occurrences, the tale of Sarah Jennings' midnight encounter on Old Mill Road stood as the most chilling. Hollow Creek, encircled by thick forests and dotted with abandoned mills and factories, had always been a nexus of the unexplained, but it was the road itself that harbored a history dark enough to chill the marrow in your bones. Sarah, a pragmatic nurse in her mid-30s, had never believed in the ghost stories and legends of Hollow Creek. She lived her life by the tangible and explainable, guided by the steady rhythm of logic. However, on one unseasonably cold night in October, her beliefs were to be tested beyond their limits. The night in question had begun uneventfully as Sarah left the hospital after a long shift. The clock in her car blinked 12:06 a.m. as she turned onto Old Mill Road, a shortcut she often took to shave a few minutes off her drive home. The road was notorious for its poor upkeep and eerie atmosphere, particularly where it skirted the old textile mill, now a decaying husk that loomed ominously against the starless sky. As she drove, the fog seemed to thicken, swallowing the weak beams of her headlights and dampening the sound around her. Sarah's sense of unease grew as the familiar hum of her car seemed muffled, the only other sound the occasional scrape of branches against the roof as she passed beneath overhanging limbs. Suddenly, her car lurched, a loud bang echoing through the cabin as the engine sputtered and died. Sarah, heart racing, tried to restart the car, but it refused to respond. Her cell phone, typically a beacon of connectivity, displayed no signal, a rare occurrence that fed her growing panic. Stranded, with no way to call for help, Sarah considered her options. The thought of leaving the safety of her car was terrifying, yet the idea of staying put until morning seemed equally daunting. Just as she was about to step out, a knock on the passenger window froze her in place. Heart thumping, she turned to see a figure shrouded in the thick fog, barely visible against the dark backdrop of the road. The figure, a man, gestured for her to roll down the window. Reluctantly, Sarah complied, opening it just a crack. "Car trouble?" the man asked, his voice oddly calm against the backdrop of her distress. "Yes, I don't know what happened," Sarah stammered, clutching her keys tightly in her hand. "Bad spot to break down," the man replied, glancing around as if to punctuate his point. "I can give you a lift to the nearest town, if you'd like." Every instinct screamed at Sarah to decline, but the alternative, spending the night in a dead car on a haunted road, pushed her to accept. She gathered her things and stepped out into the fog, the chill immediately seeping into her bones. The man led her to a nondescript car parked a few yards back. As they drove away, Sarah's unease grew, not just from the situation but from the man himself. He was silent, his face intermittently illuminated by the passing lights, revealing little but deep, shadowed eyes and a hard-set jaw. Without warning, the car veered off the main road, bumping along a narrow dirt track that led deeper into the woods. Sarah's panic flared. "Where are we going?" she demanded, her voice sharp with fear. "A shortcut," the man replied, his tone flat, unconvincing. Sarah knew then she had made a mistake. As they drove further from the road, her thoughts raced, calculating her chances if she were to jump from the car. Before she could decide, the vehicle stopped abruptly in front of an old cabin that seemed to emerge from the fog like a spectre. "You have to understand, they made me do it," the man said suddenly, turning to her with a haunted look in his eyes. "The voices, they won't let me rest." Before Sarah could respond, the car doors locked with an audible click. The cabin door opened, and another figure appeared, this one even more imposing, its features obscured by the darkness. Frozen in terror, Sarah watched as the figures approached the car. As they drew closer, the first whispers of their conversation drifted through the cracked windows, discussing her as if she weren't there, their voices a chilling mix of eagerness and sorrow. Sarah pressed her back against the rickety door of the shack, her breath shallow, eyes scanning the dim interior for anything she could use as a weapon or a tool. The only light was the ghostly luminescence seeping in through cracks in the walls, painting eerie streaks across the dirt floor and the strange symbols. Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs, each beat a loud echo in the oppressive silence of the shack. She moved slowly, her steps cautious as she approached the center of the room where the pentagram was drawn. Memories of the stories she had heard about Hollow Creek, the tales of lost souls and dark rituals, swirled in her mind, now terrifyingly real. The air felt charged, heavy with a presence she couldn't see but could definitely feel, as if the shadows themselves were alive, watching her every move. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulsate subtly, a sickening pattern of movement that made her stomach churn. Sarah forced herself to look away, focusing instead on searching the room. In a corner, partially hidden under a decayed piece of top, she found a rusty old crowbar. It felt solid and reassuringly heavy in her hands. With the crowbar clutched tightly, she turned just in time to hear the faint creaking of the shack's door. Her breath caught in her throat. Shadows danced across the thin gaps as something or someone silently tested the entrance. Sarah tightened her grip on the crowbar, her entire body tense, ready to fight. The door pushed open slowly, groaning under its own weight, revealing nothing but the thick fog rolling in to fill the room like a living entity. The temperature dropped sharply, her breath now visible in the icy air. But it wasn't the cold that made her shiver, it was the realization that she wasn't alone in the room anymore. A low, mournful wail cut through the silence, rising and falling like the wind singing through the hollows of an abandoned grave. Sarah swung the crowbar in front of her defensively, her eyes darting around, trying to locate the source of the sound. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, enveloping her in a cacophony of despair. Then, out of the mist, figures began to form. They were transparent, ethereal, and moved with languid, sorrowful motions. Their faces were blurred, features washed away by time and torment, but their eyes were clear, deep pools of misery and longing. They circled around her, their movements synchronized with the haunting wails that filled the shack. "Please," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking with fear. "I don't want to harm you. I just want to leave." The figures paused, and the air grew oppressively still, the silence sudden and complete. Then, one of them, a taller figure with a slightly more discernible face, stepped forward. Its mouth moved, and though no sound came, Sarah understood its words, feeling them more than hearing them. Asterisk help us, asterisk it seemed to say, its voice a mere echo in her mind. Asterisk free us. Asterisk Sarah lowered the crowbar slightly, her resolve mixing with confusion. "How?" she asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. The figure pointed towards the pentagram, and as Sarah's eyes followed, she noticed that one of the candles around it was different. It was newer, unburned, and unlike the others, it was black. The figure's gaze bore into her, imploring. Understanding dawned on her. Light the candle, complete the ritual, perhaps reverse it. She didn't know if it would work, but the silent plea in their hollow eyes was enough to convince her to try. Moving slowly, she reached for the candle, her hands trembling as she took out a lighter she always carried with her. As the flame took, the air around her shifted. The figures began to fade, one by one, their faces showing a mix of relief and eternal sorrow. The wails died down, a final sigh escaping the lips of the figure before her as it too started to disappear. But just as the shack began to clear, a new, more powerful force surged through the room. The ground trembled, and the walls of the shack creaked ominously. Sarah spun around, the crowbar raised again, as a new, darker shadow formed in the mist. Unlike the others, this one was massive, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. It moved toward her, and the entire shack seemed to bow under its weight. Sarah backed away, her mind racing for a solution, her heart pounding against her chest like a drum of war. As the shadow loomed closer, its features more monstrous than anything human, Sarah realized that whatever this thing was, it was the source, the reason for the haunting, the binding force of the curse that held the souls of Hollow Creek. The The shadow roared, a sound that shook the very foundations of the shack, the noise reverberating through Sarah's bones. It was a primal sound, filled with anger and an insatiable hunger. The air around her seemed to pulse with its rage, the fog swirling more intensely as if feeding off its energy. Sarah stumbled backwards, her foot catching on a loose floorboard, nearly sending her to the ground. She caught herself just in time, the crowbar still gripped tightly in her hand. The shadow advanced, its form becoming more defined, less like mist and more like a creature of darkness, composed of nightmares and malice. Its eyes, if they could be called that, burned like coals, a deep, malevolent red that seemed to bore into her very soul. Panic set in, raw and overpowering. Sarah knew she couldn't fight this creature, not directly. Her mind raced, searching for any kind of strategy that could help her survive. The cabin, now feeling like a cage, offered little in the way of refuge. The pentagram on the floor glowed faintly under the light of the newly lit black candle, its glow steady in the chaos. A desperate idea formed in Sarah's mind. The pentagram, perhaps it could be used not just for summoning, but for banishing as well. Her knowledge of such things was limited, gleaned from books and movies, which suddenly seemed woefully inadequate. But there was no time for doubt. With the creature advancing, she had to act. Dropping to her knees by the pentagram, Sarah placed the crowbar across it, forming a crude barrier. She recalled reading that iron could disrupt magical energies. It was a long shot, but it was all she had. She shouted, her voice laced with both fear and defiance. Back. Stay back. The creature paused, its advance slowing as it reached the edge of the pentagram. It roared again, the sound deafening in the small space of the cabin. The windows rattled, a few shattering under the force of its cry, sending shards of glass flying through the air like deadly rain. Sarah shielded her face with her arms, feeling the sting of glass as small pieces nicked her skin. She peeped through her arms, her heart pounding, and saw the creature staring at her, its face contorted in frustration or perhaps confusion. The iron crowbar and the pentagram were holding it at bay for now. Breathing heavily, Sarah looked around the cabin for anything else that might help her. Her eyes landed on the symbols on the walls, now glowing with a soft light. Maybe, just maybe, these symbols were part of the containment ritual. With no better plan, she began to recite loudly any Latin phrases she could remember, hoping that the traditional language of old rituals would have some effect. Surprisingly, the symbols on the walls began to pulse more brightly with each word she uttered. Encouraged, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with hope. The creature recoiled with each pulse, its form beginning to waver, edges flickering like a flame in the wind. As she chanted, the wind outside picked up, howling around the cabin as if an echo of the creature's roars. The door banged against its frame, and the remaining glass in the windows vibrated. The whole world seemed to shake, centered on this very spot, on her very actions. Yet, just as it seemed the creature might be banished, the black candle flickered violently and went out, plunging the cabin into near-total darkness. The symbol's light dimmed, and the creature's form stabilized, its malicious red eyes piercing the shadows. Sarah's heart sank. The room was now lit only by the faint moonlight filtering through the broken windows, and the distant rumble of thunder forewarned of an approaching storm. The creature took a step forward, the pentagram's barrier apparently weakened without the candle's flame. In that moment, Sarah realized she was running out of options. The cabin might not hold much longer, and she couldn't relight the candle without getting dangerously close to the creature. Desperate, she searched the room with her eyes, looking for anything she might have missed, any opportunity to reignite the candle or fortify her makeshift barrier. As the creature took another step forward, the floor beneath it creaked ominously, a reminder of the cabin's fragility, and perhaps a hint at a new possibility. If she couldn't go through the creature, maybe she could go around it, or even trap it. She needed a plan, and she needed it now, as the creature prepared to strike, its entire being focused on her, the shack trembling with the weight of its malice. As the creature advanced, the floorboards under its immense weight groaned and shifted, hinting at the age and disrepair of the shack. Sarah's mind raced, grasping at the fleeting hope that perhaps the structure itself could serve as a trap, or at least a delay against the dark force before her. The cabin, with its weakened floor and brittle bones, could be more than just a cage. It might be a weapon, if only she could use it correctly. The creature took another heavy step forward, and a particularly loud crack echoed through the shack. Sarah's eyes darted to the floor, noting how the boards bowed under the creature's weight. An idea sparked within her, desperate and dangerous, but it was all she had left. If she could lure the creature to a weaker part of the floor, maybe, just maybe, she could cause it to fall through. Moving slowly to keep the creature's attention, Sarah began to edge around the perimeter of the room, her movements calculated and deliberate. The creature's eyes, glowing with a sinister red, followed her every step, its body turning to keep her in sight. The air was thick with the stench of decay and the oppressive power of the creature's malevolent presence, making each breath Sarah took feel like inhaling smoke. "Come on," she whispered under her breath, her eyes on the particularly weak floorboards near the far corner of the shack. She needed to get there, and she needed the creature to follow. As if understanding her intent, or perhaps simply driven by the desire to capture her, the creature lunged forward. Sarah dodged to the side, her heart pounding in her chest, and the creature's heavy foot came crashing down where she had stood a second earlier. The impact was enough to splinter the wood, sending shards flying, but not enough to break through. Sarah backed away, drawing the creature after her. "Here, come on," she taunted, her voice louder, her tone a mix of fear and defiance. She was near the weak spot now, just a few more steps. The creature, growling low, a sound that vibrated through the floor and the walls, followed, its massive form looming over her. Another step, and another. Sarah could see the floor bending under the weight, hear the ominous creaking that spoke of imminent collapse. With a final glance to ensure she was in position, Sarah jumped away just as the creature took another step forward. The floorboards finally gave way under the strain, breaking apart with a loud, splintering crash. The creature, caught off guard, fell through with a roar of rage and surprise, its descent into the darkness below marked by the crashing of debris and a cloud of dust. Breathing heavily, Sarah watched as the hole in the floor swallowed the creature, the shadows seeming to envelop it. For a moment, there was silence, then the sound of movement from below, a thrashing, angry noise that grew fainter and then stopped entirely. Had she done it? Had she trapped it? Sarah didn't know, and she didn't wait to find out. Turning, she ran from the shack, her legs carrying her as fast as they could through the fog and the dark woods. Behind her, the shack seemed to groan and settle, as if it too were relieved to be free of the creature's presence. She ran without knowing where she was going, driven by the primal need to escape, to get as far away from the shack and the nightmare within as possible. The woods were dark and unwelcoming, but the fear of what lay behind her propelled her forward, every noise making her heart skip, every shadow a potential threat. Finally, exhausted and unable to run any further, Sarah collapsed near a stream, the cold water loud in the silent woods. She lay there, panting, trying to gather her strength, her mind still reeling from what had happened. She was alive, but at what cost? And was it truly over? The stream flowed beside her, its water cold and clear, a sharp contrast to the darkness of the night and the terror she had just escaped. As she lay there, trying to calm her racing heart, a faint glow appeared upstream, a soft light that seemed too deliberate, too steady to be a trick of her imagination. Drawn to it despite her exhaustion, Sarah got to her feet, her limbs heavy, her body aching. She followed the stream towards the light, her curiosity overpowering her desire for rest. The light grew brighter as she approached, revealing that it was not a single source of light, but rather several, floating just above the water. They were orbs, glowing softly, moving slowly along the stream like a procession. As Sarah watched, one of the orbs floated closer, its light illuminating her face with a warm glow. It was beautiful, mesmerizing, and for a moment, Sarah forgot her fear and her fatigue. But then the memory of the night crashed back into her, and she stepped back, wary of any new mysteries these lights might present. The orb paused, as if sensing her hesitation, then continued its path downstream, followed by the others in a silent, ethereal parade. Sarah watched them disappear, the soft glow fading into the darkness of the forest. The beauty of the moment was stark against the backdrop of her recent terror, and it left her with a deep, unnerving contradiction of emotion. As the last light vanished, the darkness seemed to deepen, reminding her of the immediate danger she might still be in. Turning away from the stream, Sarah considered her options. She was lost, somewhere deep in the woods of Hollow Creek, with no idea of the direction back to her car or the main road. The night was cold, and the fog seemed to be getting thicker, swirling around her in dense, damp clouds that clung to her clothes and chilled her skin. Her survival instincts kicking in, Sarah started to walk, choosing a direction at random, hoping it would eventually lead her out of the forest. Every sound in the dark woods was magnified, the rustling of the leaves under her feet, the distant call of a night creature, the soft murmur of the wind through the trees. Her mind played tricks on her, shadows moving just at the edge of her vision, making her jump at every perceived movement, every potential threat. As she walked, the fog seemed to pulse with a life of its own, ebbing and flowing around her in waves. At times, it was so thick she could barely see a few feet ahead, and she had to slow her pace, her hands stretched out in front of her to fend off unseen obstacles. It was during one of these thicker waves of fog that she heard it, a soft whisper, almost too low to be heard over the rustling of the leaves. "Help us." The voice was faint, barely a breath, but in the silence of the night, it was as clear as if someone had spoken directly into her ear. Sarah froze, her heart thumping loudly in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaky, straining to see through the impenetrable fog. No answer came, but the whisper repeated, a sorrowful, pleading echo that seemed to come from all around her. "Help us, please." The voice was definitely that of a woman, or perhaps several women, intertwined in a chorus of despair. The sound seemed to move, drifting through the trees, and Sarah, driven by a mix of fear and compassion, followed. The whispers guided her, always just a few steps ahead, leading her deeper into the forest. The terrain grew rougher, the ground uneven under her feet, and several times she stumbled over roots and rocks hidden by the fog. Despite the obstacles, she pressed on, the voices growing slightly louder, more insistent. After what felt like hours, but could have been only minutes, the forest opened up into a clearing. The fog lifted here, and the moon, full and bright, shone down, illuminating a scene that took Sarah's breath away. In the center of the clearing stood an old, gnarled tree, its branches twisted and bare. Arrayed around it, like some macabre art installation, were dozens of small, handmade dolls. They were hung from the branches with strings, their tiny bodies spinning slowly in the gentle night breeze. Each doll was different, but all had one thing in common: they were blindfolded, their little cloth eyes covered with strips of rag. The whispers were louder now, a mournful wail that seemed to emanate from the dolls themselves. Sarah approached the tree, her steps hesitant. As she drew closer, she realized that each doll had a name written on its clothes in faded letters. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, not expecting an answer. The dolls continued to spin, and as they did, the whispers changed, morphing into soft sobs and pleas for release. Sarah reached out, her hand trembling, and touched one of the dolls. At her touch, a sharp wind picked up, swirling around the clearing, lifting the fog and whipping it into strange shapes. Suddenly, from the edge of the clearing, a new figure appeared. It was a woman, old and bent, her hair wild and her clothes tattered. She moved towards Sarah with surprising speed, her eyes intense and knowing. "You should not have come here," she hissed, her voice as cold as the wind. They are bound to the tree, and now, so are you. Sarah stepped back, her mind racing. The tree, the dolls, the old woman, what had she stumbled into? And how could she possibly free herself from whatever curse this place held? The old woman continued to advance, her hands raised as if to push Sarah towards the tree. Desperate, Sarah looked around, searching for an escape or a weapon, anything to help her fend off the ominous threat. Her back brushed against the cold bark of the tree, the doll swirling ominously above her head. The wind intensified, the whispers of the dolls growing louder, almost deafening. Sarah's heart raced as she realized her situation was growing dire. The old woman's shadow loomed over her, her fingers gnawed like the branches of the tree itself. To free them, you must replace them, she rasped, her voice blending with the howling wind. One living soul for the souls tied here. Your arrival was no accident. Sarah's mind spun with panic. She scanned the clearing, desperately searching for any option that could help her escape. Her eyes landed on the dolls again, their blindfolded faces spinning slowly. An idea sparked, desperate and dangerous, but it was all she had. If I free them, will you let me go? Sarah asked, her voice loud against the wind, hoping to strike a bargain. The woman paused, tilting her head, considering the offer. Free them, and you can take their place, she said, her tone greedy, expectant. Sarah nodded, feigning agreement. She reached up and hastily began untying the dolls from the branches, her fingers nimble with urgency. With each doll released, a small sigh whispered through the air, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lighten slightly. The old woman cackled, moving closer, her eyes on Sarah. Hurry, girl, your time is almost up, she sneered. Sarah worked faster, her mind racing with each freed doll. She needed to be clever, to use this moment to her advantage. As the last doll was untied and the wind picked up its scattered form, she made her move. With a sudden dash, she lunged for the pile of fallen dolls, scattering them across the clearing. The old woman shrieked in anger, lunging towards Sarah, but the distraction was enough. Sarah sprinted towards the edge of the clearing, her breath harsh in her throat, the cold air biting at her skin. Behind her, the old woman's curses faded into the night, drowned out by the increasing distance. Sarah ran without looking back, her legs burning with exertion, her mind singularly focused on escape. The forest seemed endless, each tree a potential obstacle, each shadow a hiding place for new horrors. But she pushed on, driven by the raw instinct to survive. As dawn began to break, the forest thinned, revealing the outskirts of Hollow Creek. Sarah stumbled out onto a road, the first rays of sunlight warming her chilled skin. She collapsed, exhausted but alive, her breath coming in great, heaving sobs. She had escaped the cursed clearing and the sinister old woman, but the experience had changed her. Sarah knew the forest and its dark secrets would haunt her, the echoes of the doll's whispers a constant reminder of the night she had faced the horrors of Hollow Creek. The town of Hollow Creek, once just a place she passed through on her way to somewhere else, now held a new meaning for her. It was a place of deep, dark woods where shadows lived and whispered, a place where every local legend had roots that twisted deep into the ground, intertwining with reality in ways she had never imagined. As the sun rose higher, casting light on the path back to town, Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for the questions that would come. She would tell her story, warn others, but part of her knew the truth was too bizarre, too frightening to be fully understood or believed. But it didn't matter. She knew what she had seen, what she had escaped from, and she would carry that knowledge like a shadow, always present, always lurking just out of sight. Sarah sat by the roadside, her breath finally evening out as the early morning sun began to chase away the remnants of night's chill. Cars passed infrequently on the old country road leading out of Hollow Creek, each one a reminder of the normal world she had temporarily left behind, a world oblivious to the dark forces lurking just beyond its periphery. She knew she couldn't just leave the forest and its secrets behind. Not completely. The images of the old woman, the dolls, and the sinister presence in the woods would haunt her dreams, but Sarah felt a responsibility now. She had to warn others, to prevent the curious or the unsuspecting from wandering into the same nightmare. After a few drivers ignored her outstretched thumb, a local farmer finally stopped. He eyed her warily, noting her disheveled appearance and the wild look in her eyes. "You all right, miss?" he asked, as she climbed into the passenger seat of his old pickup truck. "I've been better," Sarah replied, managing a weak smile. "Just had a rough night in the woods." The farmer nodded, as if he understood more than he wanted to. "Those woods, they ain't right. Been that way for as long as anyone can remember. You're lucky to come out at all." Sarah turned to look out the window, watching the forest recede in the distance. "Yes, I am," she whispered to herself. As they drove into Hollow Creek, Sarah's resolve hardened. She would write about her experience, document it in a way that no one could ignore. She needed to investigate further, to understand more about the history of the woods and perhaps find a way to cleanse them of their dark influence. The farmer dropped her off in the center of town, near the local library, a place as good as any to begin her research. Sarah thanked him, her mind already turning over the possibilities. The library, with its archives of local history and newspaper clippings, would be the perfect place to uncover the secrets of Hollow Creek. Inside, she was greeted by the musty smell of old books and the quiet murmur of pages turning. The librarian, an elderly woman with spectacles perched on her nose, watched Sarah curiously as she approached the desk. "I need to see your archives on local folklore and history, especially anything about the woods," Sarah said, her voice low. The librarian studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Follow me." As they walked through rows of bookshelves, Sarah felt a chill pass through her, a reminder of the forest's lingering presence in her life. They stopped in front of a large filing cabinet in a secluded corner of the library. "Everything we have on the local lore is here," the librarian said, pulling open a drawer. "Be careful, though. Some stories are best left untold." Sarah looked into the librarian's wise, old eyes and saw a flicker of understanding, perhaps even fear. "Thank you," she said, turning her attention to the files. Hours passed as Sarah pored over the documents, piecing together centuries of mysteries and unexplained events all linked to the woods. The more she read, the more she realized how deep the darkness went, how many lives had been touched and taken by whatever forces resided there. As the library clock chimed, signaling the time to close, Sarah gathered her notes. She had much to do. Her experience in the woods was not just a personal trauma, but a story that needed to be told, a warning that needed to be shared. Stepping out into the fading light of day, Sarah felt the weight of her task. Hollow Creek, with its dark woods and darker secrets, was now part of her. She would write her story, but she would also seek help. Experts in the paranormal, historians familiar with ancient rituals, anyone who might help her combat the darkness. The road ahead would be long and fraught with danger, but Sarah was determined. For herself, for the soul still trapped, and for the unwitting who might one day wander into the woods, she would fight to uncover the truth and seal away the darkness. As she walked down the quiet streets of Hollow Creek, the setting sun cast long shadows that seemed to whisper and shift, as if echoing the library's warning. Some stories are best left untold, but not this one. Not anymore. Sarah knew that her fight had only just begun, and she was ready. The darkness had not counted on her resilience, her courage, or her newfound resolve. And above all, Sarah was not alone. As she continued her research, gathered allies, and prepared for the struggle ahead, she carried with her the hope that one day the whispers in the woods would be silenced, the shadows dispersed, and the light restored to Hollow Creek.